The Sprightly brothers are back at it. Forget the Peaky Blinders. You have the Peaky Sprightlers here in Alex, Connor McLean, and Luca Teller. Welcome, Alex. How are you today?
I'm doing fabulous. It's great to be alive. It's great to be here with you, my fellow human becoming. I'm ready for this episode.
I'm ecstatic, man. I'm really joyous. I seriously am. This whole past week, I've been putting myself in different conditions physically and testing our philosophy as physiology idea. This week, I've decided to start incorporating swimming a bit into my weekly routine. And so I do that like 4 or 5 times a week now, a nightly swim. And the thoughts that percolate, man, I've been figuring out. It's like, when you finally eat a nice fiber heavy diet and you finally spit out that gum from like seventh grade. I mean, shit
Mm.
out that gum. I feel like I've just cemented and concretized ideas that were percolating in my psyche and in my mind since seventh grade. And I've really just had them come to fruition by just being underwater for a while. So, any thoughts on that?
That's crazy. Yeah, I sounds like it would be something that works. Really interesting idea to start us off with there. Thanks, Luca. My gosh, how the different physical mode of thought really influences the conceptual determination of that thought.
That's a new one.
How by swimming underwater, by leaning more into think about if you go for a hike versus go for a run versus go for a long walk, swimming and engaging in that philosophical mode. I would have thought that makes you a little bit more, submerged and almost fluid would be the metaphors on hand, but you've said it's actually been a process of hydration, which is a process of concretization. Like when concrete hardens, that process is called hydration. There you go. You've seen it here already. The Beast of Bali is showing you all how to how to how to win friends and influence people.
Oh man, that's number one on the to-do list to read, man. After Phenomenology of Spirit, it's got to be How to Win Friends and Influence People. I was also thinking, do I just forget?
Such a
Um,
nerd.
should I forget Merleau-Ponty and just read Diary of a CEO? That might be the way to go. We're here to talk about Aristotle's Metaphysics, and this is episode 12. Thank you everyone for who's kept along, whether you're following along and actually actively reading and studying with us or just listening because you like us. I've also heard comments and personal reach outs from individuals who are ongoing listeners who have commented on Alexis's eyes. They say that when he wears the right shade of green, they really, really do come to the fore more than they already are. So take that for what it's worth.
That was the feedback we got. I love how like majority of the feedback is not based on the content of what we're talking about, the context of two bros around the campfire, just sitting around, having a good time, wearing green if it's your color, wearing dark gray, black if that's your color, and hashing it out. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. I was even thinking about how this being a podcast, but actually we should really just think of it as a happening of podcast. And yeah, I won't say anymore. When we call this thing a thing, we're just castrating ourselves, and we already do that enough by being here and talking and confessing. So we
Yes.
don't need to
Yes.
call this a podcast. This is just a podcasting that is happening, people.
No one with a ball sack is sitting down and talking ideas with another man with a ball sack. So, given that we're engaged already in the most castrated and bastardized version of what we could be doing in our 20s, let's leave it at that. Having said that, please subscribe so we can do much more of this and have the license to do so. And we often start this with a quote to set the scene, and then we do a bit of a recap, and then we get into the discussion more proper. Um, I'm enjoying this exchange as much as I'm sure I'll enjoy the actual conversation to come. But someone I was thinking about underwater this week was Archimedes, friend of the show, most valued subscriber. um, Partially because I was thinking so much about this discussion and how Archimedes often misunderstood, very similar to our boy Aristotle. You know, he kind of fits the same camp of he's just excellent and such a astute man of aptitude across disciplines, across so many disciplines, that he gets misunderstood, he gets misappropriated, he gets misrepresented, sometimes purposefully for people's nefarious aims and stuff. But one thing that he gets reductively thrown down into is just being a mere himself being a reductionist or an objectivist who doesn't understand anything but his own Archimedean outside point. How that relates to us is, a few discussions ago, we brought in the idea of a noble neutrality and how that differs from mere scientific reductionism, say post-Enlightenment. And what I wanted to give credit to Archimedes and people of his ilk for is this same movement of what has retrospectively been dubbed the Archimedean outside point is really just a reliable starting point from which to commence doing damage, doing metaphysics, understanding substance. And it's similar to what we spoke about and gave a lot of value to Hegel for, where you want to examine a system, you want to get into the nitty-gritty of it, make sure you take a note of it outside of it so you have something to hold on to while you do it. Something has to be holding you in place when you're being dissolved elsewhere entirely. So it's a similar move as the upward ascent of the mountain, and how your corporeal self remains intact as your internal or spiritual self may be undergoing complete dissolution and retransfiguration. So it's a similar move I see even the most raw, dry, analytical thinkers like Archimedes making. And to set the scene with a quote, which is probably one of my favorite in history, he says, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." And yeah, I just want to celebrate and applaud his optimism there. From the depths of numbers and entities and abstractions, he says something as frolicking and rollicking as that, where he's just gallivanting through the fields saying, give me numbers so that I can appropriate them, so that I can do with them what my will wills. And that's what I hear in friend of the show, Archimedes.
He gets very close there, doesn't he, to confessing himself. And if we think to Nietzsche, who in our last conversation where we really got at and uncovered, and towards the end we really had that realization of that almost philosophy being a disclosure of a confession of a physiology. And that's why physiology is so important, because at the end of the day, ultimately what we're doing is like just telling people about our bodies, right? And like how our bodies and our minds are, like, even if you're an idealist, like ultimately your ideal thoughts are happening like within your brain in some capacity. They're mediated by it. If you axe the brain, you axe your thoughts. And so the body holds all that intelligence and wisdom, and hence why philosophy as physiology is going back from the philosophy as confession and back from the philosophy as, back to physiology. So just getting to that base layer and making sure that you have the right amount of carbs in your system, even, if you want to experiment that you've been swimming and thinking at the same time, that's all sound, that's all part of it. I just have a quote from Nietzsche, which we alluded to at the end, and I'd like to allude to it again at the start, just to preface all of this and to show how so deeply philosophy is about oneself and is about one's own ensoulment, and not in a way to just subjectivize and like prioritize the subjective position in philosophy, but to show that we don't have any other options but to assume that position and then to master it. Like, we shouldn't be afraid of making our own personal bias influence our philosophy, but we should master the way that our own personal bias can influence our philosophy. So you get that kind of Zen shift that takes you all the way that you need it to. Quoting Nietzsche, "It has gradually become clear to me what every great philosophy up until now has consisted of, namely, the confession of its originator, and a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography, and moreover, that the moral or immoral purpose in every philosophy has constituted the true vital germ out of which the entire plant all has always.
Is that from Beyond Good and Evil?
That is the opening line of Beyond Good and Evil. And I think it stands by itself, but to give and I think it also is what we have just been talking about. So it's really how what Nietzsche is seeing there and what is clarified more through philosophers after Nietzsche was the psychoanalysis of the philosopher. And Nietzsche is here, saying it has gradually become clear to me that, every great philosophy has consisted of a confession, essentially. And there we go again, back to the previous episode with the confessions of the non-essential as one of the key drivers of cultural discourse and of cultural neuroses. And when we're confessing the non-essential and we're making a fetish of that, then we're so far left astray from, our bodies leading us astray from actually getting to truth. Like we're getting to the determination of our bodies rather than the determination of the concept. And without that proper materialist dialectical transmutation of our bodies, then we can't think through like, okay, on this day I woke up, I was in a particularly bad mood. That's why I wrote these things. Like this is how I was feeling. That was so intimately connected with my free expression of thought. And if you can't get to that level of realizing your bodily self and your free expression of thought, then you don't have that materialist dialectic, which is so essential to realize the absolute. So we need to constantly incorporate and dialecticize all that's happening in our organism and in its expression.
Totally, man. And something you said in the middle there stuck out to me about we're not just here to subjectivity max, We can view this more as as Nietzsche being the handmaiden to a pathway to Hegel. It's like how love is the fundamental value, truth is its handmaid. And Nietzsche gives us enough of a toolkit that we can go back and actually unlock Hegel in a sense. Hegel in the sense of the reflector reflecting on reflecting, and able to do that now because we've gone through the weeds and Beyond Good and Evil and realized that a confession is exactly that. It's the metaphysical prejudice of the thinker. The confession is actually just a conviction, and there's no shame. And he says this he says this outright in a quote in that same section in Beyond Good and Evil. The ass arrives beautiful and most brave. There is a point in every philosophy at which the underlying assumption appears on the scene.
Yep. That's brilliant. Where was that from?
From the starting of Beyond Good and Evil. Not the intro, but I think section 1 or essay 1 proper. It's called Prejudices of Philosophers.
Yeah, so he's even like kind of giving us the analogy of that being the ass, right? Being the donkey that we ride on, being like the instinct, which isn't like a stallion. We're not riding in on like pristine and, prowessing assumption.
The basal, the libidinal is the ass.
Yeah. And also, right, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on that ass. On the donkey.
On Thick Lizzie, baby.
On Thick Lizzie. I'm getting a donkey and I'm calling it Thick Lizzie, and it's just going to be a running joke on my farm when I settle down off the grid.
By the way, the 4 of you that have joined Alex's Substack, why are there not more of you? And also join his church as well. So if you want to be a part of this offshoot, like breakaway civilization he starts on a farmland, then start by getting onto his Substack.
If you want to meet Thick Lizzie, you've got to be in the church from the start. No, it's super profound. Like we're making these great jokes and jests, and yet Jesus rides to Jerusalem on a donkey. And I don't think we're doing some bad equivocation here. I think it's intentional that he's on some poorly beast of burden, right? And that he's not on this like pride, angels singing and dancing, cheering his song, glory. Like, no, he rides in on a donkey. And like, it's also like the profound inversion that Christ is able to make to that Jewish culture. They wanted a king. They wanted the king to wear his shining crown and command them forth, but Christ swapped that crown for a crown of thorns, and he rode on a donkey. And what Nietzsche is saying about that is that, hey, actually, do you mind reading that part again? Do you mind reading that quote again?
There is a point in every philosophy at which the conviction, the underlying assumption of the philosopher, appears on the scene. The ass arrives, beautiful and most brave.
Why is it beautiful and most brave? Like he's pulled that out of the Christian message as well. Like you can say Nietzsche kind of was the big philosopher of the Antichrist, but he was a philosopher of the Antichrist insofar as it would like save and revivify something like Christianity. Like it's kind of Nietzsche knew that he only spent time with his opponents that were worthy, and he spent a lot of time with Christianity and of denying Christianity, but only because of its worth. He would call himself the crucified one when he was going insane later in life. Like he identified with Christ, not with Christianity, but with Christ. He was like very close to it. But yeah, like beautiful and brave. I think as well, what you said of, when you get to a place of confession as conviction, like that is just remarkable. That's gold right there. And I think it is when we're confessing the non-essential, we like fetishize it. We are in a bad relation to it. But when we are confessing as a conviction, that's when it's like freedom is, I have no choice but to act in this way. Like I know it's misguided, and I know that my ideas, my philosophy, what I'm living is something that can be like undone, that can be duped, but I'm also convicted in that orientation and in that mode. So when someone goes, oh, by the way, like this whole Christian thing, and like you can't, prove it, question and undermine the faith, you kind of say, of course it's kind of incomprehensible and unbelievable. Like of course this could have not actually happened and taken place. And yet, by the same token, of course it had to have happened. Like there's no other way than this sequence of events taking place. And I think when you get to that place, that's when you're like really just holding these paradoxes and tensions so close together that it just aligns totally in you. And and then it makes like a symbol when you bow and those hands are so close together. Like there's almost that inseparable distance between them. There's always a adjacency here. My hands do not become like joined into one. They're always adjacent but totally close, and then that creates a higher form symbol. And it's all in there. It's all in meditative practices and embodiment practices. It's all about finding that chi and flow when you bring lots together, and they never sublate each other, but they come unified in some sense.
Very well put. Brother, oh brother, I promise to the viewers we'll get to the zetas in metaphysics, but I don't want to lose this thread that we have in these early stages. So I just want to add a few more little wrinkles to this Christ image, because you can imagine poetically Christ's countenance as he's riding into Jerusalem, the level of assuredness that's there. There's nothing ironic. He's not aware and doing some postmodern move of like, here's what I'm doing, this is what the people will interpret it as, and that will be good. He's not doing this move of self-recognizing, then acting. What he's doing is also what Nietzsche is doing here, by the way, for people that haven't read Beyond Good and Evil or Zarathustra, to my knowledge, is explaining what was widely misunderstood with the three metamorphoses. So one of the key insights or key passages even in Thus Spake Zarathustra is the three metamorphoses do I then declare. Now the spirit becometh a camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. What's most common in times of nihilism and liminal ages like ours, transitory periods, is the camel. It's the beast of burden, as you put it perfectly. That is the phrase for the camel. But the camel is an image, it's an animal that's a bit antiquated, and we don't really understand it. So he uses, especially in the 19th century in Europe, the story of the ass, because he is also well laden. He is also a beast of burden, someone on which you lay, but also himself laid. But yeah, basically, the camel, and in this case, Buridians. No, sorry, the ass is something that is dedicated to a tablet of values. The ass is letting himself be rid, right? Be ridden on, rodden on. I'm not sure what the tense is there, by Christ. There's also like an acceptance there to be filled. So the ass is apprenticing himself to something higher. That something higher is the highest man to ever lived, in this case, riding into Jerusalem. But that whole image itself is captivating and encapsulates self-mastery. The ass is not some animal that's just a mere passive sufferer who's not, playing a part in this equation at all. Like we spoke about with the master slave dialectic, the psychological recognition that's provided in this case is paramount. Active endurance, bearing burden, and all of this ultimately building inner fortitude. So even this, you can say, reduces down into or assimilates within a grander image of walking uphill and self-mastery. And so much of that is going on when Christ is unironically riding an ass.
And it shows like that's also the way of, because Christ is like Christ was the child, Christ was the baby that was born and the heavens sung. Like he is the promise of pure potential, man. And this goes to like shout out Tom Lyons and his great work in spaces. Like he had this thought of like God as pure potential, and because potential is like everything in front of you that can be actualized through choice to be being. So it is through to be being and to enact becoming. Like all of that is the choice that's in front of us, and we can make choices that better afford coherence, and we can make choices that exclude coherence. Pure potential as God is a very interesting idea, and I guess it's at the core of Christianity you have that idea of pure potential and pure light, thingness, presence, interacting and intersecting to create the world. It's actually a little bit too uncannily close to Aristotle's notion of like substance, substrate, and essence creating the world, creating being. We'll get to that when we get to Zeta. But finishing this line,
That's ultra key though, right? Coherence, not subsummation or sublation, like you said.
not representation. Yeah, not states, like cohering processes, cohering states, but not like static things and stuffs. But Christ, when he's born, like is this baby, and we have so many images of Christ as a baby, and like statues and icons with Mary holding Christ, or even just representing Christ as a naked child, and seeing like the absolute goodness and pure potential for good that is incarnated. And that's the nativity scene where all the animals are there and recognize Christ and kind of are like harmonious with Christ. So all the instincts and all the, as you said, like all the blood vessels and the heartbeat and the calcium in the bones, like all of this bodiness to philosophy and to theology as physiology, let's not, is there in that nativity scene. And so Christ riding in on the donkey is simultaneously the recognition of the baby in that Nietzschean three metamorphoses, riding back on the donkey, on the camel, the beast of burden to start with. And it's to show, the donkey has no choice but to kind of bow its head and accept Christ and walk him forward. And so Christ is then that whole union of the child and the camel in Nietzsche's metamorphoses. And it is really like the camel is something that submits, it bows down and kind of says, it does the good moral job. And then you get to the lion and it's wanting to overcome the good and the moral, and really wanting to kind of construct its own values, and revalue values. Like it's a real emphasis on that becoming and overcoming. But then when you do that, it comes back to the child. It comes back to that self-rotating wheel where it's not just a case of deconstructing social order or social norms and like asserting something more artistic and better in its place. It's also then coming back to having that fondness and softness of character to realize love and compassion and playfulness, to put yourself in contact with the divine play and with Leela, is what the child is able to do. So yeah, great point to bring in on Nietzsche's Metamorphoses. Yeah, it's amazing.
I have to add a bit to that. This is amazing. This is
Oh,
so well lubricated once again. Um, but yeah, I think the lion is the second stage, absolutely, and Christ making the donkey his bitch is just tip top perfect. He is clearing away the old to make room for the new. The thing that the lion is most known for is is this titanic struggle and antagonism it faces and ultimately wins against what Nietzsche calls the thou shouts. And I'm thinking of the Pharisees that try to one up Christ by saying, what do we do now? This commandment conflicts with that one. What do we do? Do we stone the homo? And then he says, he who is without sin cast the first stone. And it's always the meta move, right? It's always the meta move of there's a decalogue. This is a set of axioms. There's a meta axiom that allows and affords the decalogue to exist in the first place. In this case, representing the general abstraction of the thou shaltness. But the whole point of that image is to carve out space so that the herd, in Nietzsche language, the rabble, the mob, doesn't massacre what is to come, what is the new and the innocent, which is of course the child, the self-rolling wheel, like you said. But the other key distinction here is because Christ has made the donkey his bitch doesn't mean he forgoes the donkey. It's very much, to state the obvious, an integration rather than an overcoming in a alpha bro sense, right? We're not here to simply endure, then rebel, then create anew. It's a spiral of development, not a linear chain or a dry ascent. It's highly fractal, highly polyvalent, and at any one stage of any useful model, you will be simultaneously in various places of the model, depending on perception, cognition, and what part of your self-development is currently being foregrounded and exacted and engaged with and asked of you. And so there's also going to be backtracks. There's going to be times where there is the image of creating space for the new, but then something all of a sudden wasn't as you thought. It doesn't go the way you thought. And then you have to backtrack, which is also accounted for in schemas like this. You have to, Nietzsche uses the phrase garnering the utility momentarily of a previous stage, which is just absolutely perfect. And so that's why these things are perennially righteous, perhaps not true in the sense that we've already distinguished and diminished in the cheaper sense of the word truth. The only thing that could possibly ever happen is Christ riding the donkey. That's all that could ever happen because it's that which affords.
Yeah, I was just even thinking about the Christian dialectic and what Nietzsche is trying to do. Nietzsche's whole three metamorphoses was like his kind of grand encapsulation of the three metamorphoses of spirit. Like he really put his heart and soul and body into that. And you can think about it even thinking from like the Old Testament to the New Testament, how in the Old Testament with the story of Moses and the 12 commandments you have this real submission to the law, and you think, yes, this is the transcendental law, we're going to abide by this, and we are going to be very fearful of God, our ruler, when we transgress, for the fear of punishment that comes. So we submit to the law and we believe it as real. Later on, you then have, the Greek, you have the Jewish people that kind of found their state and have like kings that rule. You have King David and a line of kings that, are there, and there's very much more a sentiment of, wanting to establish the state as salvation and wanting to overcome the other rules in the area, like the threats of Babylon and knowing that these are the evils that must be overcome. And it's almost like that great beast of Babylon, right? Which in the story of Revelation is just this like formidable dragon. And a dragon with every scale has thou shalt written on it, and you're trying to overcome that dragon. The lion's goal is to try and overcome the tyranny of the commandments. And so you have a lot of that sentiment, and through their kind of battles and conflict, and eventually what they're left is in the state of not having overcome like the Roman rule. So they are ruled by the Roman rule. They are ruled by the dragon of thou shalt, and the Jewish people as a lion and their spirit is trying to break free out of that. And what comes is Jesus riding a donkey. What comes is actually a submission in some sense to the thou shalt, but in a way where you advance beyond it such that your submission then overcomes it, like it undoes it. And that's what you see in Christ, and that's the history that follows. So within Christianity, you have those movements from the being a beast of burden and the camel in the desert, right, to the lion, and having a tyrannical and tough figure to contend with in the dragon, like the kind of conglomeration of all fears. And then you have the child, who was born and who saves, and you have the New Testament, which really explicates that. And yeah, man.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I mean, for Nietzsche, it was the greatest sin against the spirit with a capital S to combine the Old Testament with the New, because of the vast difference in array of scale, scope, and strength between the Old and the New Testament. He talks about the monstrous seismic things that are said in the Old Testament that makes the tame house animal Christians of today shudder in their sleep. And it's just really funny the way he quotes it and phrases it. And he talks about the necessity of purity in spirit when approaching these matters, and understanding truth as that kind of indisputable, irrefutable image of Christ riding into Jerusalem, and how that contrasts with your typical, say, scholar of European 20th century, what we call the wise man, the sage, all these archetypes and tropes that he's trying to wash away and say, these aren't the people that are going to be my disciples. These aren't the people that get it, man. And the seeking of truth must be an insatiable rapture and an elation that just drives you. And there's a will, there's a very hyper masculine, I want to say, drive that's forcing you towards the fountain of youth and the elixir of life, that is one and the same with truth. One second. And yeah, he's basically saying that you cannot conflate that with what the wise man calls truth, because his end goal, his end state, is nothing more than mere self-contentment. He is chasing ataraxia. So yeah, he derides those self-proclaimed cultural Christians and scholars and sages against that. He says, 10 truths must thou find during the day, otherwise wilt thou seek truth during the night, and thy soul will have been hungry. It's like saying you shouldn't commit adultery because it ill accords with good sleep. Like, really? Is the reason you don't want to commit adultery because of the guilt? Shouldn't your truth seeking, shouldn't your cultural conscience, personal moral compass be much higher than that? Why do you even want to do it, but you're held back by a tablet of values? So yeah, I hear all of that in what you and he was saying.
Yeah, what I'm hearing there in the drive to truth, and sort of being animated and impassioned by your own self-determining will, in some sense, rather than external statuses. And I think it's one thing to care and know moral and ethical codes, like the real, relating to death, relating to sickness, relating to like real beauty, and real goodness, like being close with these kind of facts of life that we hold as transcendently important. It's not that we disregard them, but it's that we hold them and see them in a way which they are a little bit more being held and seen among all the other parts of life that can be held and seen. We're not prioritizing this one set of phenomena of life to be like hyper important and, stand outside of the rest. If it's all graspable to us, then it all kind of sits in this remit of here we are, of Dasein, right? Of thisness in life. And so it's, yeah, like realizing that impassioned or erotic self-determination, like what you really care about, what you really feel strongly towards, when you let that have more of a say rather than just, hey, no, I'm referring to this standard. Like, no, we shouldn't say those things. We shouldn't act like that. God is a figure in the sky watching, and so you cannot, swear in a sacred place. Like the kind of standards that we hold really true serve a purpose, but aren't there absolutely. And so I think that almost, yeah, impassioned drive that is an alternative mode is something that like this podcast is just manifesting and flourishing for us. Evidence of this is every time I get off one of these episodes, I say, God damn, like that was my favorite episode. I'm so thrilled by like what we get to and where we arrive with these discussions. And it's just like each one is just like layering and layering and building on it. It's now got to the point where in the last episode, when I said this was my favorite episode ever, and I sincerely meant it, and you gave me a good reaction because you get me. I say that to everyone else, and they're like, "You say that every episode," and I'm like, I have nothing to say because it's true. Like, I truly mean that each new episode is my new favorite episode, and it's because it's an ascendancy. It's because it's an anagoge. It's a vertical spiritual ascent, and each time anew, there's a new sublation of what we've talked about and a new synthesis that we're reaching, and it's just got this progression now. So I really, yeah, relate to and wanted to ground what you were saying there and like the experience of this podcast that is happening, this podcasting that is happening right now.
The anagogic is always multi-axes, and it's a deepening, it's a heightening, and an exalting altogether. And I feel that too, and I share that sentiment as well, where every episode feels like my new favorite, but for a vastly different reason, strangely, perhaps paradoxically, to the previous one. This one felt more like an enlivening, that one felt more like a deepening, that one felt more like a self-dissolving, and yet I enjoyed it because I'm a cuck. But yeah, either way,
But
I fully share that. And a term I wanted to bring in that brings in Aristotle, Nietzsche, Hegel, and a bit of ourselves is nominalism, and one we haven't spoken about so far. And nominalism as a school of thought, as a way of being, you could even say, where you foreground, if we're being highly reductive, the material over the abstract, and that being a, put simply, a refutation of Platonism to begin with, and that's where Aristotle comes in, where he has his own brand and his own, say, style of anominalism. But that is something where it's a way of being that is fundamentally exclusionary in the way we've been speaking about with manifesting will and virtue. Nietzsche also says in Zarathustra, let me find it, my brother, when thou hast a virtue and it is thine own virtue, thou hast it in common with no one. The minute it becomes groupthink, it's gone. If it's groupthink, it was never there to begin with. It has to be hyper individualistic, and it's a little bit saddening for a lot of people when they have this dawning realization amongst the vicissitudes of life that they're actually so alone. But when you find these patterns and ways of operating and contextualizing and interpreting the world, and a hermeneutic like nominalism, for me, it gave me a lot of respite and a way of breathing out, a sigh of solace, kind of the fact that I don't have to look at two dogs and be like, it's because they share in dogness. That, for some reason, gave me this giant sigh of relief. It made me think, okay, so this thing of this, the Hinterwelt, as Heidegger and Nietzsche say, the back worldsman, we don't have to engage in. We don't have to worry about a refuge for the weak. things can exist in a hyper particularized form. I, a hyper particularized individual, can exert my will or be absolutely demolished as it brandishes itself on me. And I'm engaged in this titanic struggle and this combat with life and its elements individually right here in front of me. And the the idealism of it fades away momentarily, but perhaps to the animation and the impassioning of the moment. And isn't that what we want? So, yeah, I just wonder, I guess, as an open ended question, where do you think nominalism, if anywhere, fits in with all of this?
I think Aristotle is certainly criticizing Plato from a nominalistic point of view in some ways. Like what I'm, and this is a bit of a stretch, and I'm purposely being vague here, but Aristotle is wanting to make a criticism of Plato that says, hey, we don't want to abstractify the forms or the essences of things and put them in a place that exists without the particulars here and now. And so he's wanting to almost uphold that each individual substance has its, and each individual essence has its own substance. Plato wanted to say that Plato wanted to say that individual things have universal essences, and that the universal essences take a primary mode of intelligibility in some sense. But Aristotle is wanting to almost make it more discrete and say, hey, everything does have an essence, a substance, but it's like its own unique form of coming together of form and matter that creates that. And you can't take away one and have the other enduring. Like for Plato, you'd be more like saying you can take away the physical particulars of things and still have these forms that are in a platonic space somewhere. And Aristotle wants to actually just connect them at each touch point with the earth, with the concrete, sensible particulars, and show that they are really inseparable. And so, in some ways, there's like a form of proto nominalism, which you can kind of get in that way. So, that's kind of how I would think about the nominalist urge to discretionalize everything and make things discrete.
Mm. Absolutely. Yeah, that's really well put. I was seeing a lot of that in the initial chapters of Zeta as well, where he's very explicit about separability as a prerequisite for substance. So I wasn't sure exactly about how that ties into what branch of nominalism. I just knew the sort of 101 version of it, and I knew that it resonated with me. So that's reassuring. He talks about prime matter, which we can get into, and that's where a lot of this really the rubber meets the road. But yeah, I mean, did you want to do a recap of last episode, or are we past that?
Aren't our viewers so damn lucky that we've got this far? It's been so juicy, and we haven't even done the recap yet.
So like, share, and subscribe. And I love you to the end of this world and back, Alex. Thank you for being here. Actually, no, before you do anything, let me say a few words of love towards you. I was reading another Aristotle book in which I found a quote that really stuck out to me. He said, friendship is a slow ripening fruit. For though we love both the truth and our friends, piety requires us to honor the truth first. And so there's this thing that exists in the hyperspace between two noble entities, such as ourselves, if I do declare myself, that hangs and hovers there meaningfully and lifts us both. And it's a serious alivening and an engagement of a triumvirate, really just sparking and resparking, just like a fucking sensor field constantly, that I feel our ever deepening friendship to be. So it's a weird place to mention these words because we're right in the middle of the juicy part of it. In terms of the wider series too, we're probably at the halfway point in episode 12 right now throughout the entire what will be the entire corpus of our version and interpretation of Aristotle's metaphysics. But yeah, some words of hope, relief, and vigorous and rigorous love towards you, my friend. It's been a privilege hitherto, and I'm sure it will continue to be, because I view this as not a cheap friendship where we're here to fill each other's holes. We're here to realize that we have no holes and make sure we add none. And in fact, to the contrary, add whatever unholes are to each other's lives.
Luca, my trusted confidant, I really appreciate our friendship that is inspired by the good and by the virtuous. And as you said, like the ontological primacy of truth. I love you, but I love the truth more. And it's a good thing that you love the truth more than you love me too, because that means that we can get along really well.
It allows us to not have to say no homo every 10 seconds, right? We always have one thing that supersedes the other person, and that thing is not a male person. So it's like, oh, thank God we're safe.
I'm still gonna say it to just to be safe. No homo. Yeah, let's get uh, into the last episode, which was actually a surprisingly French episode. We had
Hmm.
Deleuze and Lacan take center stage, and I think fair and well deserved to give the French some airtime, having been with De Duce for a while. The German, Hegel, that's right. Hegel took a backseat, and we looked at a lot of other exploratory modes. We looked at some of the psychodynamic forms of thought. You know, we looked at Lacanian psychoanalysis and understanding what's really at play when we're confessing. And for Foucault, how a lot of like just modern discourse and search for truth is just seen as this like just like unmediated confession of, you know, emphasis on verbiage and the spoken language and all our communication, and how you have to have status in a brand to be someone or anyone, because that's what, you know, reflects the truth, is, you know, that recognition and being in the spotlight. And so there was a bit of a criticism on that mode of thought. And yeah, it took us to some really interesting places, I think, as well. And you know, we tied that with the Aristotelian notion of the non-essential as being discarded from his inquiry into being. You know, these particular parts of the world which change and have like a temporal dimension to them, such that if you take off your clothes and put something else on, or you know, you have your crown on and you take it off, that there's an identity still preserved, but it's not in the closeness or the crownness of something. It's in what endures beyond all that transition.
Hmm.
We also voiced some other concerns about that, like the ways in which the unessential do create something substantial. So the way that fashion influences and imprints on people, and the way that the ability to take the crown off and back on is very constitutive of the concept of a king itself, that, you know, and of a real leader, to be able to, you know, get your hands dirty, lead from the front, is what qualifies you as a leader, is what gives substance to your determination as a leader, is the fact that you're willing to like do the things that a leader normally wouldn't do. So there's a kind of process where the non-essential does hold relation to the essential, and I think that's perfectly Hegelian. It's obviously it's negation and it's affirmation that are enjoined in the concept, and so we need to preserve those through and through. And you can't just negate Heraclitus. You can't say that, hey, it's only identity that preserve. You can't say identity preserves itself through time for things that have substance. The things with which identity doesn't hold itself through time is insubstantial. I don't think you can say that. I don't think Heraclitus thinks definitely you can't say that. He thinks that identity doesn't hold. You know, you can never step into the same river, for it's not the same river, and you are not the same person. So there is a tension there that we explored, and gosh, we didn't resolve it. We're not here to resolve things. We're here to get close to them and uh, sniff them out, and then, you know, I don't know what you do after that.
What do you do post sniff?
Post sniff, well, at least you've got the scent, right? You can, yeah,
Philosophy is bloodhound.
yeah. And I think, like, hey, we must confess that this episode is non-essential. We haven't even got into Aristotle yet. And yet this is the essential, non-essential. This is why Aristotle was limited, because time and time again, you can see how essential and non-essential are at play. They are both needed. I think even if we clarified language all the way, as we did in a previous episode, even if we made this ultra unambiguous and definitive, we would still find this like logical paradox between the ideas that we're talking about, between what we're referring to. I think it still preserves itself. I don't think you can have a criticism where all of these paradoxes and seeming confusions are just due to slight inconsistencies in the way that language is being used. I think it's true to the concepts themselves. And I think, the concept is outside of language. It's not something that we speak to, it's something that we observe as unfolding over time. So I'm kind of happy to, really like make that step and make that claim that this, this episode here is both essential and non-essential. It's not essential because we haven't even got into like Aristotle's strict text here, but it's essential because it's totally essential to the spirit of this podcast, of determining ourselves and making it original and bringing Aristotle into these modern conceptual challenges. And also, like, as we go on throughout this episode, it's almost like we're extracting from the text some of the key terms. Like later on in this episode, when we talk to the substance, substrate, and essence, and understand how that is a dialectic that is the very core of being, that's when we are also like going into Greek translation. We're not like sequentially reading through this book as we have been doing. We're kind of pausing for a moment and doing open heart surgery to really see what is at the heart of Aristotle, to see what is at the core of his body of work. Notice the metaphors that are just infusing the body and the thought and the philosophy. All of that is widely accessible and available to people. Embodied metaphors about philosophy. That's what we're doing, which is simultaneously a super essential thing to do, to really like understand the terms. Anyway, I'm not going to labor the point. I feel like I've got it across. I think in the last episode as well, we really looked at how Hegel would think about these concepts, and what we kind of saw was actually, when looking at Hegel, and Hegel is someone who's building and admires Aristotle when going back. When you look at what Hegel is able to offer us, Hegel gives us a radical reappraisal of the foundational, and we're contending with this. We're studying his labels, we're reading his fables, we're putting it all on the table that Aristotle made available.
Whoa. Have you signed up to the streets of Manchester yet or not?
Kendrick Lamar, if you need a feature.
Bro, if Kendrick needs a 13th writer for that same 3-minute song, then we have you. Wow. Can you say that again, please?
Hegel gives a radical reappraisal of the foundational, and we're contending with this. We're studying his labels, we're reading his fables, we're putting it all on the table that Aristotle made available.
Man, the sexy teacher that makes philosophy fun, that's what you are.
Oh my God, give it to me. Yeah, that's me. I want to be making philosophy fun. That's totally it. We talked about accidental being. I think we've covered this. Aristotle makes it clear that accidental being is not being, and that also truth is not being. Truth is a representation of the world that we can judge as true or false, but it doesn't equate being itself. Yeah, and so it kind of brings us to this place of identity, essentiality, and expression. When we talk about how through fashion the non-essential is expressed, and I think that's part of the dialectic here, is identity, essentiality, and expression. And yeah, like I think as well, there's so much inside of us that needs and wants to be expressed, and it is like becoming and expressing more. Think about like political movements or the the touch points of cultural discourse today. There's so much in that which are revolving around real substance, but it's coming from a place of expression that's wanting to be found, and it's being expressed through non-essential things. I think it's,
Mm.
we're expressing things which are here today, gone tomorrow, but I feel like what it's showing is that actually this idea of substance as a static and fixed entity and something which can be qualified or disqualified is perhaps not comprehensive enough through that lens of thinking about it to give us the comprehensive metaphysic that we need. And so, what I'm kind of wanting to do as part of the intention is to deepen our understanding of essence so that we can get out of the representational mode of thinking about essence and get it to the dialectical mode that we've prefigured. So, we talked about how Aristotle's logic was kind of deterministic and non dialectical, and that was a limitation of him through the law of non contradiction, which we saw just doesn't hold. We get now to actually what can rescue Aristotle and what can bring him to be relevant for today is by looking at his concept of substance, which is what we're doing in this chapter. Zeta is all about substance. And so here can we actually take the time to relearn and recognize, to recognize what is valuable and worthy in Aristotle. Yeah, I like what you said and remembered off by heart, which is impressive, from Foucault about part of the side of that confessionism and expressionism, which you can see in our cultural discourse, which perhaps isn't operating at that level of substance, is the particular Western injunction of telling.
Mm.
You know, to always be saying something. And it's almost like gossip. Like, in what ways are just our expression and overproduction of capital just a, yeah, insubstantiated self-rotating wheel? Like, it's almost the opposite of a, the self-rotation, which is just like deepening into oneself and deepening outside. Like, it's a rotation which is just trying to fill the holes that everyone has created for themselves to have. you know Even thinking about this in kind of Darwinian thinking for a moment, we have throughout evolutionary history always had to be in this state of becoming and overcoming just to feed ourselves. We've
Mm.
had to endure climate, we've had to endure hunting, we've had to endure gathering just to feed ourselves, just to be clothed, just to have community. And now we're in a place where that's all really taken care of. The feeding and the clothing and the housing is all taken care of, but we still have that innate drive totally at work within us. And so what do? We need to manufacture demand. So
Mm.
it's a manufacturing of demand to fill the holes that we also manufacture. And yeah, really, like, yeah, there's like a whole complex there, right? And that's just the structure of subjectivity. That's just who and what we are.
Daniel Schmachtenberger speaks really elegantly about the disoriented desirer and how there's such a difference in our instincts today, which we fail to recognize as a distinction between a want versus a cultivated craving. And the cultivated craving is exactly that. It's the manufactured demand that we think we want, that we think the unhealthier the species, we think we need. And it's exactly what is paradigmatic of an age with more and more information and less meaning.
And that partly links to Lacan's object petit a, which
Mhm.
was what Lacan said was the thing that he contributed to psychoanalysis, otherwise seen himself mainly as a Freudian, was that dynamic of our close relational attachment to the things that, like, our own enjoyment of something which is non-real, and that we kind of know it's non-real, and that's the function that keeps it going. Or we think it is really real, but we don't think we can ever actually get to it, so we enjoy it and it keeps going. If you think of like WWE today or just influencer culture, like TikToks that are super entertaining to watch, that we know are just AI generated or manufactured, but we still enjoy them. If you think about WWE, where you could ask someone like, whether it's real or not, and people would probably say, "Oh yeah, but like they like really hurting themselves and stuff like this." But it is, you're simulating this competition and you're simulating victory, and we're so enthralled in the storytelling. So it's partly the storytelling, but it's
Mm.
partly, I guess, why go for WWE storytelling over UFC storytelling? And it's probably like there's just an enjoyment of like the fakeness of it. Like that probably gets people going in a lot of ways.
Eric Weinstein's kayfabe, right?
Exactly. Yes, yes, yes. No, precisely. And so even Eric Weinstein's kayfabe is this whole, he sees almost like that same process of objecti are at function and at work in just Western industry and politics and government, as in science, in the institution of science, who transfer wealth through science, by knowing you have to show something to be real, but knowing that it's not, and being fine with knowing that it's not.
Mm.
Um, that sort of dynamic is at play. And all right, what else did we talk about to wrap this up? One thing I think that was important to land on was the difference between the entity and the action state. So the entity being a tree, the action state being treeing is happening, and to, yeah, like almost putting together the substance metaphysics with the process metaphysics and putting them in dialogue. That's kind of what we get to when we start to compare and talk about Aristotle versus Whitehead. It's the substance metaphysics versus a process metaphysics. We will explore this in a certain time. I think it's quite relevant. And yeah, that was interesting. Like that's why I referred to you as a human becoming at the start. It's something where to say being and to ground you in an identity is to extract something like linguistically determined, conceptually determined, and take you take you out of the essential being that you are. As I would never dare call you a human being, lest you cease to become. You're not different in each passing thought. And there's even some support of the kind of thinking of, what Aristotle does is really ground a metaphysics in a Greek grammar as well, and talks about,
Mm.
hey, this is how I think being is. And you can even see it in the language when we talk about a noun, that's the enduring substance. And when we talk about a verb, when we talk about a doing word, you have a substance in a certain state, but that doesn't change the fact that the real of that is the substance that is, achieving the state. The state is only made possible by the prerequisite of the substance, by having the subject in there to be the one that is determined by the predicate. But Aristotle thinks it's the subject determining the predicate, or at least the subject is upholding any ability for there to be a predicate rather than the other way around.
Mhm.
Um, he's definitely kind of in a linear one way valve like focus on that. And some linguists today like would still give credit to and support that idea in some ways. Because even they would say, like, and this gets us back into Heidegger and language, um, the forms of linguistic determination that we have in theory and plausibly could be intelligible to us in a similar way that higher order levels of intelligibility are realized through concepts. So the language games that we play are actually revealing the world intelligibly in the same way that, like, at a deeper level of being, that concepts are also kind of revealing being. So how much focus to the structure of language should we apply such that it reveals the structure of how reality applies? If we think about our language as something that is like matching and fitting us to the world, why would we not posit that, from this immense creativity that we have in language to explain things, Why would we not analyze its structures to investigate the things explained? There's something circular about that, but I I think it is like it's a genuine logical discourse that we make and that we, conflate and confuse far too often, the limits of my language or the limits of my world. Like that's a blanket statement from Wittgenstein, and that's along the similar vein of, yeah, just how deep language goes.
One thing
And
on that before you continue, Alex.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I think when we're talking about the validity and the immediately entrancing nature of something that's consonant with aletheia and the revealing, we do want higher orders of intelligibility revealed to us. They are revealed to us regardless. And Aristotle himself speaks about how, kind of returning the Socratic unexamined life not being worth living. Aristotle refigures that and says the unplanned life is not worth examining. And so there's this move there's this move towards, yeah, but dot dot dot, and here's my take on that. Forget the fact that the unexamined life is not worth living. Why would we want to examine something that is unplanned in the first place? And so obviously he means a specific thing when he says planned, what that looks like, and what it would look like for a scholar, poet, and statesman in the time of writing would have been very different to the ordinary member of the mob today. But I think the point still stands that there's a there's a woo woo wah wah nature to the unintelligible sometimes, and people like Socrates and Plato fall victim and are actually culpable in that. Nietzsche also says on the habit of admiring the unintelligible instead of simply remaining in the unknown and the bewitching nature of that impulse. He says in the genealogy of morals, supposing that everything known to man fails to satisfy his desires, on the contrary, actually horrifies him. What a divine way out of this to be able to look for the responsibility not in the desiring, but in knowing. There is no knowledge. Consequently, there is a God. Wow, what a novel syllogistic refinement. What a triumph for the ascetic ideal. And asceticism as being the constraint that's just running rampant in the Socrates and Plato's of this world that Aristotle then, in a very unique way, undoes. And the last point on that would just be, um, you are supposed to be you're supposed to be hesitant as to the existence, like in a representational correspondence theory of truth sense, of specific things like the philosopher's stone. So when we go searching for the philosopher's stone, we're not just searching for the thing we know exists, but we haven't found it yet. We're searching for the thing that we haven't found that might not even exist. And such is the joyous rapture of life that we still set sail. And that kind of more metaphorically pays homage to the value in the ineffability of the unifying principle. If that, in this case, is the philosopher's stone, the thing that ultimately transcendentally redeems us, gives us immortality, or whatever the episteme of the day is, and whatever knowledge allows us to construe it as, then you're supposed to be hesitant at its existence in the first place. So, yeah, that's just a little piece on, I guess, not remaining too magical and I guess too in awe of things like the unintelligible.
yeah, and it's also a comment on faith, right? And how in faith you have the dialectic between the really real and the really not real, and the really I don't even freaking know if it's real. Like that, the self-doubt that causes you to doubt yourself so much is also within the realm of faith. Christ on the cross in despair is also within the realm of faith. I think
Because
for the
there's virtuous faith that intoxicates and is the last stage of a journey to truth, and then the last stage has to be a leap. But then there's the more decrepit faith, which is just that I'll see what happens, man. And that's not what we're talking about. And that's kind of obvious, but I just want to say that as well, that there is a sober enchantment and there's an intoxicated enchantment, and both have their place, but in very different realms. My favorite movie of all time, I bring up all the time, is The Lion King. It's famously a film adaptation of Hamlet, I think, from Shakespeare. But that itself, what people don't realize is uh, that itself, Hamlet, is kind of a reconfiguring of the liberation of Jerusalem. And in that, Ronaldo, the main character, when he's in the depths of despair and self contempt and loathing, he's shown his own shield as a marker of who he is and once was and could be all together simultaneously. And it's only when we realize ourselves who we actually are in the world, and who we are is who we could be, and who we were and who we actually are at the same time, when that's shown to us and it's in our faces and made so blatantly comprehensible and comprehended, that's what makes you unenchanted, unintoxicated, sober, and yet still somehow rapturous. So I just want to say that it's not just about being in this, like, it's not about state induction and always being in this wooey gooey state. And it's also not about that.
Thank you for saying that.
Because we've credited and discredited Aristotle a lot, I think, to our credit and to his credit, that we're just playing with him, putting him down, picking him up where necessary.
And to our discredit.
No, that doesn't exist. And yeah, I just want to say, like, I guess also upon my reflections underwater, I was like, wow, there's really a noble and an ignoble way to go about everything. And that is highly personalized and subjectivized, but not detached from the objective. It's highly transjectivized.
Fuck, man, I gotta find a pool, man. Where are these insights coming from, dude? Shit.
Continue your recap and don't wax lyrical of your host too much.
Continue my freaking tirade. What is going on? The Philosopher's Stone myth, right? Like going after the unknown unknowns is, like the proper thing about that. That's why the one who finds the Philosopher's Stone, like, you enter, Knights of the Round Table, you enter the forest at the point of it that is most creepy and scary and terrifying to you. That's where you have to go. You have to venture into the possibility of negation, the possibility of negativity and of nothingness. It's almost like when Nietzsche goes into his whole nihilistic kind of angle where, he goes into the nothingness and the what is truthness and criticizes it, only for Nishitani to come along much later and say Nietzsche didn't go deep enough.
Yes.
He didn't go into the nothingness deep enough, because if he did go, he would have discovered the no thingness of stuff. Yeah, and I think it is about having that space and room open for negation as such. We're not welcoming negation because we think it's going to lead to a more positive whole. I mean, we can hope for that, and I think God always promises that there is always hope for that, but there's not a guarantee for that. And so we are contending with, like, the dark night of the soul that ends in the dark night of the soul. There's real strain on the psyche, and in being for these kind of journeys towards, anagoge. That journey is, I guess, when you have a journey where the destination is so true, I think the journey, like, is so true and pure and rewarding. The journey to get there has to have its equal negation a part of it. Like, you only reap what you sow, and if you're not sowing something that roots can go so far down, then the trees that spring forth are only going to go so far up. So you have to contend with, the depths you're willing to go on the journey are the heights that you're willing to go at its completion. And I almost think, like, I want to bring in faith and self-determination into this. I've been thinking about faith as self-determination, and it would only make sense then that self-determining that faith affords, the potential of faith, is only as, has its own contradiction within it. So we're, determining self positively by, affirming and acting courageously and having the confession of the conviction to follow a certain path or to believe a certain thing, to anticipate that there is something worth getting to and achieving in your journey. Like, in your, when you take up weightlifting and you get into it, you kind of have a faith that this is going to work. Of course, there's, like, science behind it, but like there's also a real application of oneself to that science and belief in that that is going to get you there. Maybe for a better example, like if you take to wanting to write a book, maybe you don't know what you want to write. It starts with journaling, it starts with just musings of thought. And it's only through that process of hardening of faith, of concretization, that at the end of it, when you have realized and determined yourself, you're in this place, and it's a lonely place. Maybe you've had to like tunnel vision into this just so that it could be brought into the world. But at least when you get to the end of it, what you get is a sigh of solace. And it's like, oh, like I'm here. Like I occupy this space authentically. This is my home. I know I need not stray far. And you can really like know it for the first time. Again, like the T.S. Eliot quote, I think, going in flight of many different places and returning to a place just to know it for the first time. I like as well what you had said about almost, yeah, like that knowing it for the first time is coming to a place of like where I've been, where I am, where I could go, like knowing those cards of yourself. And I've been even thinking of this idea of like a workshop that could be brought to help bring and nudge people from the new age into psychoanalysis, which is like, what's the tarot card reading that comes from yourself rather than just putting pictures on the table? If you actually constructed like the cards of your past, the card of your present, the card of your future, if you animated and projected your soul and your life and your substance into that, what would they look like? How can you read into those and allow them to take you forward? Because the imaginal readings that you're giving yourself are always coming back to those anyway. So that's something that I might even be kind of working on and
Wow.
invest in, because it brings this artistic lens with this critical lens with like psych and philosophy,
Mm.
which is really cool. Just to finish on this recap, then I'll hand it back over to you so that we can be on with the recap. Is we've seen accidental being is out of the picture for Aristotle. Truth is out of the picture for defining it. We even made comment on how string theory might have just been based on accidental being, and that's why it wasn't able to understand itself subjectively. It wasn't able to. It didn't enter the forest at the most intimidating part. It entered the forest where it thought it could make money. That's crazy. That's the world. That's science for the last. That's physics for the last 40 years, and that's a big reduction. But when you come to understand the concept in its fruition, like there's a lot of truth. There's an underbelly to string theory where that is the explainer of it. So Aristotle, what we've talked about as well, he's flirting with the idea that the grammar of language has correspondence to the grammar of being. Yeah, and where we got to right at the end of the episode was that Aristotle puts forward and establishes that the question of being is the question of substance. He hasn't said a lot when he does that, but it sets us up to really understand what Aristotle is hoping to get to when we are studying substance. It's the study of being. It's a study of the there-ness of things and the unique qualities of there-ness and presence that without would destroy being, would destroy anything that we're talking about. So he's poetically qualified these terms that we're using, especially substance. And for us, there's risk of getting too much in the representational mode of like understanding what substance is,
Mm.
because if substance is being and being is so hard to apprehend, we can define it in a lot of different ways, but how we can actually apprehend it. And I'll just finish with a link to Heidegger. I feel like Aristotle's notion of substance is very similar to Heidegger's notion of Dasein, although neither of them translate well into English. Substance is ousia, that which is, or beingness.
Mm.
Although neither of them translate really well into English, they both translate as the same thing. You could both translate Dasein and ousia, substance, as existence or being there. So although Heidegger's takes on that more personhood stance of the feeling of being in the world, and Aristotle's is more of like a noble neutral of a there-ness of things, they are quite commensurate, and I think it shows us the open-endedness that there is to Aristotle to still discover.
Bravo. That was one of the best riffs I've heard from anyone ever on the internet. I have a lot to say on that. So on the topic of substance, yes, I think both Heidegger and Aristotle converge and diverge meaningfully in a way that's applicable and relevant to us. I particularly like Aristotle's predilection towards etymology because it reminds me of my own affinity to philology and his yeah, I guess showcasing of substance as standing under as opposed to there being. But the premise and the format and the predicate rather even is the same as Heidegger of there being a noun slash entity slash identity and a preposition that places it that comprehend that allows us to comprehend it and adds just enough detail and nuance for it to be so. And I think you're completely just bang on when you talk about um, the way the technique by which we best understand Aristotle's substance is kind of in a convoluted way through faith and through the thinkers of the last 300 years. I think a lot of what we're doing is, again, what thinkers that we both relate to have dubbed opponent processing as opposed to adversarial processing when engaging in the world, when engaging in aletheia of other modes of truth. That's something we're doing. The way that we understand substance and the way we can bring higher and higher levels of disclosure of substance specifically is through its surrounding milieu. And that's why we need the last 300 years thinkers, is because what they're doing is digging up the ground around substance, the concept, and showing us how we can recognize and apprehend through contrast, going all the way back to episode 1 and 2, and that being a mode by which we further dig our feet into the ground and feel that groundedness of um, coalescing or like combining and conglomerating even ancestry with posterity, to use that phrase again. And on the topic of faith, I love what you're saying about the knights around the table and entering the forest at the point where you can make most money. That's so crack up, and it's just
So
yeah,
good.
gig economy 2026. The dominant idealism of any time Eric Weinstein talks about is usually a false narrative that hides how people can make money, and that being a way to kind of dispel with and deride mass movements and cultural moralities and basically even things like globalism. We know now, okay, maybe that's a bit more controversial, but a movement and a thought stream like globalism is usually just a wealth transfer program that poses as a charity and philanthropic effort. I'm sure there's worth to it. I'm sure there's one charity out of 10,000 that actually does give money to people. And I'm sure that giving money to people is a good thing in some twisted way that I don't understand. But whatever. The point is, I was going to quote one of my favorite ever lines is by Pope, the English poet, who says, "To err is human, to forgive divine." And I think that's something to keep close to your chest when you're engaging in what we can healthily call opponent processing, is that even in that method and in that mode of processing, there's going to be adversarial moments that are truly disruptive, not in a healthy, befitting way. And so, yeah, to err is human, to forgive divine. I also think the primacy of faith is so profound and paramount that it actually is a prerequisite for a right to existence for something. You place your faith in something, whether you are doing it consciously or unconsciously, and then you live it, then you act it, then you enact it. And the motive for that may be unknown, but what we do know is that you're giving something a limit and yeah, a right to existence by engaging in it. And it's yeah, I don't know, maybe after this you want to bring up Heidegger and the hammer because that kind of is very salient here and brings up a lot of the modes of occasioning that are simultaneously present and alive the way he talks about it. But yeah, the final thing I wanted to say was just on the dark night of the soul idea. um yeah, addressing the horror of emptiness, the horror vacui, as horror vacui, I think, as is said in Latin. Man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. So even in the depths of our self-despair, we are still willing nothingness. We don't know how to not will. We are not non-willing beings. So you best want to make that a very appropriative, very conquistador-esque move if you can, if you have the resources. But I'm also wary of the things, the pitfalls of engaging in, very optimistic opponent processing. We know that catastrophes, in this case, something turning adversarial or pathologizing in the dance of agent arena relationship, is avoided by what, again, those same thinkers would call control mechanisms. But then control mechanisms lead to dystopias. How do we employ or deploy control mechanisms that lead to not dystopia or utopia in a personal or transpersonal sense, but I don't know, what's sublimity? Like, what's the third? What's the aesthetic way to live life? I have no idea in terms of putting it to a phrase. I have every idea in terms of how to do it because I do it every day, but I don't know how to put it into a phrase. You cannot bring Lucatella down to a tagline. And then one last thing, sir, before you just launch, is these wise words from Charles Bukowski, a great thinker and poet, I think. One of the few drunken people who just never left their stupor and delirium, and yet I still respect him. A bit different to a bit Dostoevskian mixed with Bulgakov is what I get from Bukowski in the little readings I've done of him. He says, if you're going to try, go all the way. There is no other feeling like that. You will be alone with the gods, and the nights will flame with fire. You will ride life straight to perfect laughter. It's the only good fight that there is. And on that note, over to you, sir.
Bukowski, slay. Yeah, one of the things picking up on from what you said later on was, knowing how in the dark night of the soul there's, almost always movement. We as subjective agents are constantly forced to move. That is the determination of our being is movement in some ways. And I think of Zizek's book, Episemuave. I think that's actually, his book is called Less Than Nothing, and one of its original titles was going to be Episemuave, which means and yet it moves. And it's about a lot of things, but it's ultimately about the innate paradox at the ontological core of being, the contradiction at the core that allows and necessarily keeps it in flux and in movement because it is unfinished, it's undetermined, so it is ever progressing. And I almost think because we have faith to go into the forest at its darkest point and lose our bearings on the actual, we will inevitably meet God. We will inevitably meet pure potential and the pure opening up and becoming and non-finishedness of being. And that is God himself kind of harboring and creating that opening for you precisely because you went to the place that you couldn't see where the edges were. You lost sight of the map, and because of that you are able to put yourself into that pure contact of, I'm in this place of despair, I'm in this place of complete unknowing, I have lost my orientation in life, I've had a midlife crisis, I'm having a mental breakdown, and yet life continues, and yet being constantly moves, and yet you age and grow older. And I wonder if in that mixture you do reach the numinous, you get to that point where, oh my gosh, this is all still happening. You reflect on, and maybe maybe you've been in that place for a year, and then one day you reflect on it and you're like, man, I've had no hope for a year. I've been down and out. I haven't been riding any waves. Waves have just been riding me. I feel like I've been underwater. But then you look and say, but in the last year I've also I've done this and this, and this thing happened, and you start to kind of realize how much is all still happening and moving and flowing, all the while that you're finding it, feeling yourself to be so stuck. So is there a way in that hope is constantly there and is constantly there as a feature of God because of that ever-present movement, and because we are willing to go into a place where we can discover an ever-present movement? I really like what you had said around yeah, digging up substance, figuring out what is around it. Like that is, I think, truly what Aristotle would want us to do, what Heidegger would start to come around to Aristotle on, and what Hegel would just sit there like smoking a J and be like, yeah, these boys are on, they're finally like getting to it. And it is like unearthing substance. Come on, man. You know what else it is? It's putting your feet in the sand and shifting around and letting the waves wash back and forth such that you file yourself a bit deeper into it. And what is that but just shifting into the sand, just shifting that hourglass for the sand to tip, for it to clear away, for that movement through something coarse and hard, finding it to be a little bit more soft, finding there to be a bit more room about it, and allowing your identity to change in that action.
There's a famous Bob Dylan song called All Along the Watchtower. Many of the viewers would have listened to, including yourself, I'm sure, because you have a bit of a 60s rock playlist, I've noticed when I've been over a few times. Back in a past life, yesteryear, when we used to meet in person. And that line is deriding people who are not serious about life, but not serious about life in a playful sense and don't understand the lightness and the delicate fingers needed to let the sand fall through and trickle through and fall down and then pick it back up, only for it to act as an hourglass once again, and understand the elusive, ineffable nature of life itself. And the line goes, "There are some here among us who think that life is but a joke," and then he launches into a guitar solo, and it's just perfect timing if you're a countercultural Hell's Angel of the '60s, perhaps. And the other person I never thought I'd bring up is Dr. Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory. Um, when he's supposed to be going to some meet and greet in one episode, kind of like kissing ass to get grants and funding for his research projects. He says, "I'm not going. I'm above all of that." And then Leonard's like, "Dude, you've got to come. Like, it's part of the job." And he says, "Tell that professor that," and I quote, "Dr. Cooper feels that the," so he talks about himself in the third person, and he says, "Tell him Dr. Cooper feels that the best use of his time is to employ his rare and precious mental faculties to tear the mask off nature and stare at the face of God." So he's hell bent. By the way, this is the guy that the character in the show that's made most fun of, and he's ironically, not ironically, but stupidly and sensibly simultaneously, the person who's most interested in the tearing away of nature and getting to God. And he's the one that's like this annoying scientist who doesn't understand the fabric of the social world, and he's the one who's always thought to be autistic and neuro and physio perhaps even divergent and always made fun of, and he's perhaps the only guy who makes sense. And he's someone who really differentiates. He's really someone who distinguishes, who exercises the sword of judgment and cuts to pieces things that need be differentiated. He has standards, and those standards don't fit people's understanding and conceptions of um, the sociosphere, but he's unwilling to budge on those, and he's the person that's made most fun of. And isn't he the Ubermensch? Yeah.
He is the child that rides the most noblest of beasts. That's a really great riff.
It's just
You were
unfortunate that the beast is his own roommate.
well, that's that's perfectly it, right? The beast is also within, from a Jungian lens anyway. I was shadowboxing because I got so excited with that riff. I think that was like perfect way to bring in Friends, right? We're talking about Friends, no, Big Bang Theory, and to show the truth of that. And I love how it is like perfectly distilling, capturing science, right? And how if only we could have resources given to people such that their precious and gifted minds could be turned towards their field of expertise. Like, how many people get turned away from science that are genius because they realize like the politics of it? They realize the grant writing. They realize that 60% of your job is just to try to get through the bullshit to do your job. That's a pretty difficult area of work to be in if you really care about it. What I would also say to that is that you're not one to be, you haven't contended with this psyche like properly enough to really reject like some of the labor that's required. Like you're just a very much a refined and delicate purist if you think that way. And if you're not willing to get your hands dirty, then you're not willing to see your own psychological involvement in your practice and how that's influencing you. So to have to like almost think it through enough and be like, okay, I have to write this grant. This I begrudgingly have to do it. It's part of my job, but hey, it's what I signed up for. We're human, all too human, and here I am. Like, don't be a pillar saint and be like, oh, I would much rather, be Pythagoras, dancing with the numbers and the rhythms and the harmonies, and all the while it's all an abstraction and it's not like here in the earthly. Yeah, a really rich. It's a shame that those kind of moments only happen once in every like season.
Are we
I
still
don't know.
talking about the TV show?
Yeah, yeah. I haven't watched it, and it just seems like there's so much like, cheap humor, and then like boom, one of those drops, and it's like amazing. But yeah,
When you go down to rescue the Father, the Heavenly Father rescues you. So it's not like he's doing this great act of service to scientific materialism. He's reaping the benefits of those in the immediate here and now as well. Like in all of his active involvement in his studies, he's thoroughly enriched in live time by his downgoing. Let your downgoing be your upcoming, right?
there we go. We're getting into Pinocchio now. We're getting into Egyptian mythology now. Yep, we're doing it all here on Luca Tellers.
But no, I think we wove in some really nice little inklings and fragments from Zeta organically. I know we didn't get to talking about substance and substratum specifically, but we'll do that. I guess the intention, tell me if you agree, is to do that next time more properly, and I guess do the recap sooner as well. But today I think was just such a proper, thorough, meaningful little bit of a side quest that was really welcome. And I know that this episode is just going to be very enjoyable as far as our personal, I guess, time capsule goes, as well as for the records for people that are watching us and loving the content. And yeah, if you did stick around this far, please subscribe or not. But yeah, stick around either way. And any words from you, Alex, to end off?
Put it on record that this recording sets a new record. It's a new favorite episode. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're like the girl on the street corner now, where I just like, if you give me the side eye, I'm not excited because you're the girl on the street corner who does that with everyone. So you've just kind of cheapened yourself.
Okay, I despise this freaking episode. This was toxic. I'm quitting this series.
That's how I know you
No.
loved the last one.
No, I thought like, yeah, it was I won't just blanket say it was the best. It was remarkable the level of originality and the interweaving of so much of philosophy was able to be brought into this. Like we really went far and wide, we went shallow and deep, we went cultural and historical, like we
Hmm.
just moved a lot. And it's kind of we're at such a stage in the pod where it's really enlivening it. Like we're really, you have to focus so much attention on something and it goes inwards, and then all of a sudden, like, I mean, if it's a doom scroll, it's a doom scroll because there's no coming out of there. It doesn't give back. But here we're now like absolutely giving back. We went in to rescue Aristotle, and who? Hegel came and rescued us. And so it just like gives back so much. And so then to sit on this, for an extra week, we had 2 weeks in between, was just like, man, so much coming up, so much to share. He just had to get all of that out there.
The
So
Heavenly Father rescues you. I take a lot of problem with that being Hegel. I only want Schopenhauer being my Heavenly Father.
oh my god, yep, yep, so good.
Yeah, actually, I have a whole lot to say about Schopenhauer and Schelling that I'm going to incorporate next time. So that'll be cool. Thanks again to everyone for watching. Yeah, unfortunately, it's time to go, and we're almost halfway through the book. So if you haven't followed along actively, I'd suggest you do. All right, bye.